supercharged by the climate crisis.
Firmly on track towards an unlivable world.
It's impossible to escape climate news.
Billions of animals killed and whole neighbourhoods erased.
People and the planet are being throttled by our dependence on fossil fuels. There's rampant exploitation of natural resources, and politics has meant that climate action has not gone nearly as far as it should have. And then there's us, individuals, and how we process the enormity of the crisis we're in. Telling the story of climate change psychology can reveal not only the ways in which we grapple with ecological breakdown, but also how big industries, politicians, and even the media at times have warped public understanding and action on the greatest crisis humanity faces.
The first thing that comes to my mind when I hear the word climate change is disaster.
Waiting disaster?
You know, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety.
Frightening.
I think I am scared of it for sure.
Me preocupa sí un poco.
Climate change for me is quite an overwhelming concept.
Hopeless.
Muerte de todos.
Like, it really affects me and I feel like I'm to blame on some of the things.
I feel responsible in a way.
بتأثر بهاي المشكلة بس ما بأثر يعني ما إلها تأثير كبير عليها.
We already have a baby and we have a fear of future.
I do care about it quite a bit, but I also kind of feel defeated by it.
Se podría decir, somos como que el cáncer del planeta.
It's no wonder people feel like this. News of climate breakdown is inescapable. And even if you managed to switch off the TV or took a break from social media, the impact of global warming is real for many of us. Temperatures are soaring, floods and droughts are both getting more frequent and more severe. Wildlife is seriously struggling. Never before have we been more aware of the dire straits the planet is in. So why is generating meaningful action on the climate crisis so difficult?
Scientists and science is becoming more and more certain about the urgency and the problem, but we haven't still caught up with how humans respond to all that science. So that's where I've been trying to contribute.
Espen Stoknes is the author of What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. He says some of the most significant recent advances in our understanding of climate change haven't come from the physical sciences. They've come from the social sciences and a deeper understanding of how our brains work.
I'm not in any way denying that it's oil companies driving this, and there are huge campaigns, and there is corruption, and there is lobbying, and at the same time we have to ask, why does that propaganda have so much impact when 30,000 scientific studies and 6 IPCC report is not enough to counter it? And that is where psychology can come in. This propaganda plays on psychological structures, and if you're able to fish into that, you're able to exploit those irrational tendencies, and you're in a power game.
Through his research, Espen has found 5 psychological barriers that prevent climate news from sinking in and leading to meaningful response and action. He calls them the 5 Ds: psychological distance, the overuse of doom, too much dissonance, denial, and finally, identity.
So those 5 together are like clusters of mechanisms that explain why it's so hard for people to really take in the alarm.
Okay, Espen, let's start with the first D, psychological distance.
The climate is, in terms of perception and the way it's communicated, something very distant from me personally. It's far away in space.
Arctic polar bears are facing near extinction.
Climate change is not an abstract notion for these islands.
But it's also far away in time, because scientists have been fond of speaking about 4 degrees, by 2100 or the year 2050, and that time frame is very far away from my daily life.
Scientists say we're on track to go up by another 0.5 degree by 2030.
The Earth's temperature will rise by 3.2 degrees by the end of the century.
This is a global issue and it's abstract, so whatever I do, it doesn't seem to make a dent. And a lot of people have learned to focus on what you can do something about and not focus on stuff you can't do anything about.
Global greenhouse gas emissions really have to be slashed nearly in half by 2030.
I'm no scientist, but that sounds pretty hard to reach.
And finally, the people who are hurt, the people who are drowning or starving or burning in wildfires, that's many steps between me and them who are suffering. Those 4 dimensions, time, space, influence and responsibility, add up to a very strong perceived distance. Climate doesn't really trigger my alarm center.
So the next defense you have listed is doom. How does that work?
So imagine you say that climate change is here, it's now going to change everything. There will be famines, there will be breakdowns of the ocean and the weather systems. The issue is that most of the days I look out of the window and things look normal, and most of the days there is food, and most of the days people seem to go about their lives. So there is a sense that there's a cry wolf a lot of the time. And what we know from psychology is that the first time you may go into a huge alarm in your brain and you feel fear, maybe a bit guilt, then the second time it's about 40% less. And then each time it's repeated, the adrenaline goes down. So off comes another response, which is that it was uncomfortable to listen to this doom previous time, so my brain will try to avoid it. I'll change the channel or I'll go to another website, and we call that avoidance behaviors. And finally, if I can discredit the messenger, saying, oh, it's a goddamn tree hugger or climate hysteric, I can get off that doom feeling and I don't feel the threat anymore.
ما بآمن أبداً بالناشطين بالتغير المناخي وما بحس إنهم بيعملوا إشي له جد.
I don't know who to trust. Most of them seem aggressive.
They seem to be funded by some, lobbies which have their own agenda.
Now, at this point, it's important to highlight that there are many of us who do not feel distance from the climate crisis and are not put off by a sense of doom around climate news. But the third barrier, dissonance, struck a chord with me because there's a definite dissonance in some of the choices we make in our daily lives. Dissonance is best described as an inner discomfort, when your actions don't correspond with what you know and believe. People often experience dissonance when the facts that they understand and agree with, for example that burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change, conflicts with what they actually do, such as driving or taking flights. If the brain picks up that you're not feeling too good about yourself, then it comes up with justifications like,
your car isn't that bad, the neighbor's car, he's even worse. Or my colleague, she flies 5 times, I only fly 2 times a year. Or I could say, it's not Australia really, it's the US, they're the problem. Or the US could say, it's not the US, it's China. You can always blame somebody else, it's them, not me. In this way, the dissonance is removed.
And if you do that dissonance handling for some time, many can end up in a state of denial, right?
Yes, you may be a little bit alert or geared up by some bad flood or fire on Thursday in the news, but then by Monday morning you're living onwards as if you never heard. You've just forgot it. And we can see these things in the number of Google searches, for instance. After Hurricane Sandy smashed New York, there was an immense increase in the search on hurricane and climate. And then 3 weeks to 3 months later, that peak was down to the baseline again. And we call this mechanism denial. You simply learn to live without thinking much about it. Sometimes denial is used as a kind of pejorative, you stupid denier, but you can be intelligent and moral and everything. It's just a very common mechanism of the brain that we are learning to live with a deeply troubling knowledge without being aware of it any longer. Finally, identity means that I spent a number of years building up my self-image. I'm a dentist, I'm an oil worker, proud trucker. Then the same thing in terms of politics. I vote conservative or I vote left, and each time something comes up, I will scan it to see whether it goes well with my values or whether it crashes with my values. And if there is a conflict, then usually the facts will lose and I will defend my values. So if, for instance, there are climate scientists saying that what you need is a higher tax on carbon, more government regulations, but I've construed my identity as somebody who loves free markets and small governments and small taxes, then all those facts and those recommendations will crash against my values. Hence, they must be wrong because now they're criticizing me. So this is where climate discourse goes really bad, when people feel their identity threatened.
Knowledge of these psychological responses is powerful, but it's just one aspect of the climate response.
Over time, our psychological reactions have been both intentionally and unintentionally played upon. Big industry, politicians, and even the media have been able to psychologically target us, warp public understanding, and paralyze action on climate change.
What we've shown in our work is that we've been the victims of a deliberate, conscious, organized disinformation campaign.
Naomi Oreskes is a historian of science at Harvard University. She is known internationally for her work on the role of disinformation in blocking climate action.
Going back as far as the late 1980s, the fossil fuel industry has deliberately attempted to muddy the waters, to poison the well of public debate, and to prevent action by confusing us about what the problem even is.
The creation of doubt, making people question the facts, making them wonder whether human action even is the cause of the climate crisis, has been a powerful tactic for big corporations, especially the fossil fuel industry.
I think doubt is powerful because it does tap into human psychology, right? The world is filled with doubt. The world is confusing. Life is confusing. So figuring out who to trust, what to focus on, where to put our energies, that's hard. And it's become even harder in recent decades because we're bombarded all the time now by messaging 24/7. And so the doubt mongering exploits that. It's based on knowing that if people aren't sure, they'll just give up, or they'll just say, well, I'll think about that tomorrow, or that's someone else's problem, or I really got to go pick up my kids from football practice, right? So it's exploiting that natural tendency.
Fossil fuel companies weren't the only ones to play on people's psychology. In their book, Merchants of Doubt, Naomi and fellow science historian Eric Conway spent years sifting through more than 14 million documents that came out of a series of lawsuits against US tobacco firms. A strikingly familiar story emerged. Decades before the fossil fuel industry tried to undermine the case for climate change, tobacco companies had used the same techniques, even the same public relations firms, to challenge the links between smoking and lung cancer in the 1950s.
As cool and as clean as a breath of fresh air. That's Snow Fresh Filter Cool.
People were looking for a way out of that dissonance between knowing that smoking was dangerous to our health.
It is a judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
The same thing happened with climate. When climate tells you that CO2 kills.
If we don't do the right thing now, there are very serious problems that our children and grandchildren will have to face.
And then somebody comes up and says to you, well, actually, it's not really sure. These studies are counteracted by other studies. Trust us. So this is how doubt becomes psychologically beneficial, because it rids yourself out of that ugly feeling.
So when you see the same pattern being used over and over and over again in completely different contexts, except what they have in common is that they're selling a dangerous product. They're selling you something that actually could hurt you. And then you begin to realize, oh, well, these people have a strong incentive to lie. And guess what? Not only do they lie, but they lie in the same way.
To single out smoking as a causal agent is, on the evidence to date, completely unjustified.
There is no basis in the scientific literature.
They found no consistent correlation between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature.
The idea is to create confusion, because if we're confused, in most cases, we won't act.
As climate disinformation campaigns ramped up in the 1990s, oil companies and their PR firms propped up contrarian scientists to push narratives of uncertainty and shift how journalists covered the issue. Big oil became a key arbiter of whether coverage of their industry was journalistically sound. They would accuse those who didn't quote CEOs and spokespeople of bias. Their efforts resulted in a denial machine, a sprawling network of talking heads, front groups, and false research outfits built to persuade people that they have nothing to worry about.
Then, in 1998, a newly qualified PhD scientist, Michael Mann, stole the show in the climate debate with a graph that would cause controversy for the next 20 years.
I found myself under assault by this massive climate denial machine back in the late 1990s when my co-authors and I published the now iconic hockey stick curve.
Using temperature data dating back over 1,000 years, Michael and his colleagues plotted a graph called the hockey stick curve for obvious reasons, and made the case that human activity is the undeniable cause of global warming.
We believe we are seeing the effect of human beings on the climate of the 20th century.
It wasn't the first convincing line of evidence that we were warming the planet and changing the climate. There were many independent lines of evidence. But the hockey stick, I think, was more visceral because it told a simple story. All you had to do is look at it to realize the unprecedented challenge that we face today. And so all of the weight of the fossil fuel disinformation machine came down on me.
Other German scientists have called it statistical rubbish. He's been called a statistical charlatan. He has had report after report attacking the foundation. The idea that 20th century temperatures are unprecedented is what Michael Mann is peddling through the UN.
Efforts to criminalize the science that I and other climate scientists were doing.
Michael's personal emails were hacked, and selected contents were published on the internet to suggest that he and other climatologists were manipulating or hiding data.
And so this is what the fossil fuel industry and their advocates recognize, that if we can pick off one scientist and make an example of them for the others, I would just retreat into my laboratory. I chose not to do that because I recognized that that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to silence me.
Many of the media outlets that were wittingly or unwittingly part of the pylon justified the space they gave to naysayers as part of a practice of journalistic balance.
One of the skeptics, he's a senior fellow in environmental studies at the Cato Institute. And on the other side, a familiar face, Bill Nye, the science guy.
In fact, the Arctic ice has been increasing considerably over the past few months, and that is well known, and he would accept that.
I'm not sure which bit of it's increasing. Yes. If you're saying that the sea ice is freezing, it's winter, and that's what you'd
No, it's more than before. But anyhow, the point is not so much this. There's a range of views. There's a range of views on the science.
The idea was balance, right? And it was tied to a kind of ideal of objectivity. Objectivity means you try as much as you're humanly able to look at the evidence fairly, not, oh, well, I have to listen to Joe spout lies for an equal amount of time as listening to Mike tell me the truth. I mean, that's an absurd notion of objectivity. Again, the industry knew that journalists felt that way, and so they knew that they could exploit that, and they could persuade journalists in the interest of objectivity to give equal time to the industry position, even if the industry position was a lie. And even if we had scientific evidence to show that that industry position was untrue.
In July 2021, Greenpeace, the International Climate Campaigning Network, released an investigation about lobbying by the fossil fuel industry. Working with the UK's Channel 4, they went undercover to expose how one corporation, Exxon, has worked hard to push back against science, the facts.
Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that.
We finally heard someone say out loud what we had known for years, that ExxonMobil really was trying to discredit the basic science of human-caused climate change and spending lots of money in an effort to do that. Now, the lobbyists seem to think that that's fine, that that's okay. But it's not okay, because what ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies have done is to mortgage our planet and to mortgage the livability of our planet for future generations by blocking the actions we should have taken decades ago.
And then there's the wishful thinking part. We don't want the world to be terrible, and we don't want to believe that people in positions of authority are lying to us. And we find it hard, especially when those people look respectable. I mean, one of the reasons white-collar crime is hard to prosecute is because we tend to assume that good clothes equates good people, or we tend to assume that professional success means good morals. Well, of course that's not true, and yet somehow we slip into that pattern. So, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance between what we think about criminality versus the corporate executive, and we don't want it to be true. I mean, again, who's got the better message? I come along, or Mike Mann comes along and says, this is a catastrophe, we're all going to die.
The question is never whether or not we're effed or screwed. It's how effed are we?
And the CEO of ExxonMobil says, it's fine, don't worry, we'll fix it with technology.
And so we're working on technologies to help close that gap. We're working on carbon capture and storage. We're looking at biofuels, which are energy dense.
So who's got the better message? So people will gravitate to the good news message and they'll tend to tune out the bad news message.
American oil conglomerates are not the only ones with vested interests in delaying climate action. I asked Naomi and Michael if this pattern is seen elsewhere.
Certainly, climate change denial is not restricted to the United States. And if I had to say the second worst place, it's actually Australia, where the coal industry has been very involved in disinformation. But we have excellent evidence that it starts in the United States. And we have pretty good evidence that it was actually deliberately exported. Some of the institutes in the United Kingdom and Australia, in Germany, that have participated in these kinds of campaigns have direct links back to American, usually think tanks, and those think tanks have links to the fossil fuel industry.
But it's also important for us to recognize that there's some bad state actors as well involved in this. Petrostates, like Russia and Saudi Arabia, that have built their economies off of our reliance on their fossil fuels. So fossil fuels prop up these authoritarian governments. They actually fuel the aggression that we have seen from Russia. And ironically, our continued dependence on fossil fuels is used by these bad actors as a cudgel. For example, Europe's reliance on Russian oil was used by Russia to try to prevent European involvement in their war of aggression against Ukraine.
The war on climate science has petered out. Oil companies stopped pushing overt climate denial more than a decade ago. And while attacks on scientists do occur, and conspiracy theories claiming climate change is a hoax may surface occasionally, those tactics are no longer as effective as they once were. What is happening now is a war on climate action, a softer form of denialism in which deception, deflection, and distraction are used ultimately to continue delaying meaningful cuts in global emissions.
Fossil fuel interests, polluters, they have sought to deflect attention away from the needed systemic changes towards individual behavior, as if it's just about you and me changing our eating habits. Also dividing climate advocates, getting climate advocates fighting with each other online, using bot armies and trolls to divide the community. Delay, kicking the can down the road, talking about how they will use new technology that doesn't exist today at scale, as a way of excusing continued business as usual.
As you move from denying just whether there is global warming or not, the next step is it is there, but it's not dangerous.
How dangerous is global warming really?
Well, I don't think it's particularly dangerous.
Or if you accept that it's actually getting dangerous, then you could always point the finger to somebody else. So we don't have to do anything now. We can delay action because they should go first.
Is climate change real? Yes, it is. But if you want to go and really change the environment, then we need to start telling China and India that they have to lower their emissions.
And then if you accept, actually it is dangerous now, there is flooding and there is fire, but it's actually too costly to do much about it because it would ruin our economy and we would lose our jobs.
Climate change will have a major impact on employment, both on jobs and the way businesses operate.
And finally, you could say, well, it's dangerous, it is costly, but now it's too late to do much about it. Then the focus becomes on securing your life rather than doing something about it. This is a kind of continuum of arguments where you go gradually from denial to delayerism.
It's always been about delaying action, continuing to promote business as usual. That's the end game. Diversion, distraction, doubt mongering are all means to the end of delay. And it's what it was for tobacco. The tobacco industry knew they had a product that was killing people in the 1950s, but they also knew that if they could delay tobacco control, they could continue to make large profits, and they would just keep doing that for as long as they could.
But we're also seeing some progress, and it's important to keep that in mind as well. We are seeing carbon emissions now globally start to plateau, and we know that's due to the shift underway from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. The problem is it isn't happening fast enough, and in large part because of the forces of inaction and the stalling tactics that they're using.
We live in an age of skepticism. Some of it is completely justified and necessary. Some of it, though, is the product of deliberate misinformation and misdirection. It has led to distrust of well-established scientific claims about the climate.
Well, I think it's hardly surprising that people are confused and that some people don't trust scientists because they've been the victims of a campaign designed to confuse them. On the good side, I guess I could say the latest poll results show that the number of Americans who completely dismiss climate science is actually down to only 9%, despite this massive disinformation campaign. So that's really good news. The problem, though, is how long it has taken to get to this point and how many missed opportunities there have been along the way.
Climate scientists bear some responsibility for a proportion of the missed opportunities. For too long, they operated under the naive belief that their communication strategies, dry, sometimes inaccessible, and often not very engaging, were fine, and that there was no other serious way to share scientific information.
The temperature will rise perhaps by something like 0.4 or 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade.
In reality, persuading people demands a host of different communication styles, and it helps to collaborate with social scientists and communication experts who understand that it's not just the facts that you're providing.
It's how you deliver those facts in a way that's accessible, sticky, memorable.
Scientists like myself recognize now that the debate over climate change isn't really about the science. It's a proxy war over policy and ideology. And it's essential that you recognize that if you're going to target the denialism and the delayism. Yeah, it's important to talk about the science, but it's not sufficient. We have to help the public connect the dots. You know, the journalism community itself has become wise and increasingly recognizes that you don't need to have a climate change denier quoted in every story along with mainstream climate scientists, that when you do that, you're really skewing the discourse in the direction of misinformation and misunderstanding.
We looked to scientists to solve climate change because we thought if they could just explain it, then we'd act on it. Most people were pretty slow to recognize it as a political problem because it was framed from the get-go as a scientific question. I get a little frustrated actually when journalists go back to climate scientists to ask about, well, what do we do now? Yeah, they're not actually asking the right people. Now you really need to get people engaged who have been involved in social movements, who understand politics, who study political dynamics, who study social change. We need much more of that expertise right now. Yes, we absolutely need the science, but we need to better understand that the solution space is not a question of physical science. It's not as catastrophic as some affordable, reliable.
As I did the research for this episode, it became clear to me that climate psychology is really at the heart of what this series is about, seeking to understand why our response to this existential crisis is the way that it is.
There's been a pretty sophisticated psychological operation going on for decades. Our fears, skepticisms, and hope that somebody else is dealing with it have all been used against us, and in some cases we've made it easy. Now though, with time as tight as it is, and the need for understanding and action incredibly urgent, getting a grip on our psychological responses is key, and working out a strategy to counter fossil fuel manipulation is important.
So there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from communications experts when it comes to, obviously, science communication. And one of those lessons is the importance of narratives, the importance of storytelling. The fossil fuel industry, they have funded so much research. They do focus groups, they do polls. They understand which messages work. They understand how to tell compelling stories. And if we don't do the same, then we're going to lose this battle for the hearts and minds of the public.
Thanks so much for watching this latest episode. If you aren't aware, this actually forms part of a 10-part series called All Hail the Planet, which looks at the forces undermining meaningful action on the climate crisis. If you'd like to check out any of those, you can easily use the hashtag AllHailThePlanet on social media. Otherwise, look for All Hail on aljazeera.com.